Hi, my name is Brittney Ball, and today I'll be talking about creating inclusive content and why it matters. As some of you may know, I come from a very non-traditional background. I started off learning how to code via YouTube as a single mom. Very difficult. So what is inclusive content? Inclusive content is when you have content that everyone can learn from. It's not limited to one specific demographic. Everyone remembers what it feels like to be new in tech and having to learn something new. Are you creating content that everyone can enjoy? When creating content, you have to be mindful of everyone and not just one specific group of individuals. Be aware of the tone and the word choice you use when creating content. The tone of your content sets the stage. It determines whether or not a user will want to continue with your content. You don't want your users to feel intimidated when learning, and you want to make sure that the material that you're teaching is clear. Avoid using gender language and be mindful of the pronouns that you use. Avoid using words that may trigger imposter syndrome. You don't want to use words like easy and simple. What may be easy to you or simple to you may be extremely difficult to someone else. You don't want users to question whether or not they're good enough to be in tech. You want to make sure you're clearly defining jargon and not assuming that everyone knows what that word is or what it means. You also want to be mindful of abbreviations. Write it out, explain it, or hyperlink it. I know when I started learning, it was an issue because I could not follow along with what the content creator was teaching. It was always really technical. They didn't explain what they were trying to teach. The jargon was way over my head, and you have to remember, everyone isn't going to be senior, so you have to include the noobs when creating content. When discussing accessibility, be mindful of bias and harmful language. Be mindful of learners of all levels. I know when I started my journey, the issue was that videos, a lot of the different articles that I would seek out to learn from, they seemed to not be for me. They would cater to learners who came from a more traditional background with degrees or just exiting college. And myself, having a non-traditional background, it felt like I was being singled out. You want to make sure you're not making users feel like the content is not for them. Remember how I felt when you, yourself, started in tech. Remember the imposter syndrome you faced. Remember how hard it was to learn something new. Keep this in mind when creating content. What are some benefits of inclusive content? Companies, users, and content creators alike can benefit from making their content more inclusive to all demographics. Creating inclusive content does not limit you to one type of individual. This not only opens doors to a more diverse audience, but it increases your hiring pool. When you have inclusive content that you can clearly understand, you want to learn more. You want to implement what you're learning. That is not only good for the employee or learner, but it's good for the company. Who doesn't want employees that are eager and ready to take over the next task? So how do you tell if your content is inclusive? I know when I started, I questioned myself a lot, especially when it came to learning a new technology. Is your content easy to follow? Do you give clear direction? If users have to go back and Google what you're trying to say, your content is not inclusive. Is the topic clear? At the end, can a user summarize what you were trying to teach? I know when creating content, we sometimes get in our own head and feel like we're writing for ourselves. That's a big no-no when creating content. You have to remember, you're creating for learners of all levels. Are users still confused after they read your content or after they watch your video? That's not inclusive content. Are you creating content that everyone enjoys? You can tell if your content is inclusive by the feedback that you get from users and those who read your content. Creating inclusive content is one small step to ensuring the future of tech is inclusive. Thank you for listening to my talk. Be sure to follow me on Twitter at Brii, BRII _toe, TOE _knee, KNEE. Thank you.
Brittney, that was such a great talk. How are you doing today?
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Do you know where the general put his armies?
No, where did the general put his armies?
In his sleeveys. Yeah, his arms and sleeves and
Okay.
Sorry for that. Sorry, I had to go back to it. One thing that I love so much about your talk is you talked a lot about your stories. You shared your stories about when you started. And so I want to dive into some of those things a bit more if you don't mind.
Sure.
All right. So one of the things that really hit me hard about your talk, you said a handful of things that really cut deep for me. And, one was you said, you don't want people questioning whether they're good enough to be in tech. And I feel that, I empathize with that. I also see that a lot in some of the people that I work with and mentor, and especially career switchers or people who are new to the field. Why do you think that feeling comes off so strongly for people that when they see something that's not for them, they question whether or not it's them as opposed to the industry or the scenario or anything like that? Why do you think that happens for people so much?
I think it's like imposter syndrome. You get nervous, you just don't, if you're not grasping it, you feel like it's something you're doing and you don't question whether or not the content is the issue. You question yourself. I think in this industry, especially tech, we're really hard on ourselves. Tech is ever changing. And so we just question whether or not we're good enough or we're cut out for it all the time.
I mean, that seems like systemic too, right? That seems like it's just baked into the culture of the way that we do it. Is there a way to reverse that or defend against that? Have you seen ways that we can at least soften some of that stuff?
I think having a good team around you and maybe implementing mentors that'll reassure you that you aren't the only one that faced this, you aren't the only one that went through this. Having a good support system when you're starting out and mentors is the way to go. You just want to make sure you have a solid team behind you.
I know there are a lot of people that are listening and attending the conference that probably want to be those support systems for other people who are newer and or younger or switching or things like that. What does it look like to be part of a good support system? What are some of the behaviors? What are some of the actions that people can take to be supportive for others?
Just be empathetic. Remember what it was like when you started out. You have to remember the struggles that you faced, and you have to be empathetic. You also have to keep in mind everyone has a different learning style. Be aware of that person's learning style and just reassure them, that they're doing great and, small wins, give them, kudos for their small wins. That builds confidence and that helps them feel better about themselves and makes them more eager to keep going forward.
I love that you brought up that everyone forgets what it's like to be a beginner. I remember when my wife and I, when my wife was pregnant with our first daughter, and the whole pregnancy process, the amount of trauma that a woman's body goes through for those 9 months, it's mind blowing. Yeah. And then I remember around 18 months after we had our first kid, I remember my wife going I think we could have another kid. And I was like, do you not remember? And she didn't even have a really terrible pregnancy process at all. But why do you think we have that kind of short-term memory, where we all were beginners at some point. We all have stories about struggling with, not knowing how to design that thing or not being able to code that thing. And then at some point we seem to forget it. We seem to assume that everybody else is an expert. Why do you think that is? Why do you think we forget about that kind of stuff?
I just think it's once you get over that hump of, and you feel oh, I can do this, and you start building up that confidence, it kind of builds towards, I guess, cockiness a little bit. And so like you slowly forget like how hard it was because you feel like you're at a place where, everything's easy breezy, but like you have to remember like how hard, like I know I had like a many sleepless nights where I was learning something and like I stayed up really late, cramming and trying to get get it into my head. And, I keep that in mind when I'm talking to my mentees. Like I went through the same thing, and like you have to remember, like remind yourself, like just to be supportive.
Yeah. One thing that really was impactful to me about your talk is you said, like, you were reading some articles and they just seemed like they weren't for you.
Yeah.
What are some of the signals? Because I see that a lot, especially with groups that are underrepresented in tech. Things don't seem to be for women or for people of color or for, transgender folks. Like, what are some of the signals that say to you, oh, this isn't for you? And maybe what are some ways that we can, because I think a lot of that stuff is probably unintentional, but it still exists. So what are some ways that we can be more intentional and be more impactful about that?
Some signals for me, maybe the first two paragraphs, if I find myself like really not focused, if the content doesn't grasp me and I can't understand what the reader is trying to like inform me about, like I'm like, okay, this is a little bit more senior, or this wasn't written for my type of audience. So like I try to like maybe find something. I usually try to like find content that's more noob friendly. Or like I really don't like when I find content and I have to Google. Like that's like a pet peeve of mine. If I have to like go somewhere else to like define what you're trying to say or get a better understanding of what you're trying to say, like it makes me not interested in like. I feel like a lot of people feel that way. Like when you're learning something new and you can't follow what they're trying to say, it's like immediate, like turned off of what they're trying to teach you. It's not cool.
Yeah, gotcha. Let's talk a little bit about design systems. There's some questions in the chat specifically about inclusive content as it relates to design systems. So one question from Sean is, how would you go about starting to introduce voice and tone into an existing design system? And Sean mentions that's been a particular struggle of theirs because it's already built. So if you have a design system already there, how do you start to get kind of inclusive voice and tone guidelines in there as a starting point?
I would say, that's a tough one. I would say maybe for that particular one, have your junior designers go over it and like explain it in a way that how they read it or they understand it, and have them interpret it. So if they can interpret it in a way that, if they can interpret it in a way that they understand it, the design system, I think that it will come across clearer to others too. So I think having like maybe some sort of what would you say, like I'm looking for a word. I can't. But like having more juniors go over the content and then interpret it how they got it, how they understood it, what they got from it. I think that would help.
That's such a great guideline, and it's such a counterintuitive one because a lot of times when I think about who we have review our work, it's usually someone more senior. Usually someone that's like, oh, let's show it to somebody more senior because they're going to be able to evaluate it. I don't think I've ever heard a recommendation for like have somebody more junior look at this to see if it's accessible by them.
Yeah.
What a great guideline. There's a related question too here in the chat from Sarah, who says, are there ways to test out if content is inclusive or not? Like, and I don't know if maybe that means quantitative ways or some qualitative ways. Do you have any tips on that?
No, I think that I would say the same thing. Like if you can have like mentees or someone understand it, like I think the best way to test it is to test it on someone else.
to give it to someone else and to use it. And if they can use it and they can clearly follow what you're trying to explain, I think that's the best way to test it. Even if it's not someone that works with you, maybe it's someone that's not in tech, but if they can clearly understand what your approach or what you're trying to say, and they like, if they have that aha moment, I think that you are inclusive. Like you have to make sure. So my approach is if I can explain something to a child and they can follow what I'm trying to say, then I know that I'm doing it correctly. I don't want to say that, compare juniors to children, but like you have to break it down in a way that even a child can understand. So if your content is clear enough for a child to understand and follow, then I think that it will be inclusive for anyone to understand.
That's really good. My daughters are 8 and 6. Well, I guess 9 and 6 now. My daughter just turned 9 last week. And I typically run a lot of my work problems by them sometimes because they just have really good insights. Like, I don't treat them as my therapist or anything like that. But sometimes, I try to say to them, like, I had a really tough day today because, of this particular thing. And they have such good advice for me. And and what I find is it's so simple. Like, because I sort of break it down to them in a simple way. And so they're able to give me simple answers back. And I'm like, man, I should do this more often. This is really good.
Exactly, yeah.
A couple other questions kind of related to that. There's an anonymous question in the chat. How do you ask a senior dev to be more inclusive to you, to communicate to you more inclusively? So if somebody is not doing that for you in a way that you understand, is there kind of a graceful way to say to them, like, hey, can you break this down for me a little bit better?
I have actually struggled with this in the past where it was sort of intimidating, or especially on a job, to tell maybe a senior or maybe your manager that you're not understanding what they're trying to get across. I usually would request maybe a one-on-one and ask them for, so I'm good at like pair programming or having like a one-on-one session and having them explain it in a way and them go through it. And then like, I could like, okay, now I understand it. You just have to communicate. I had that struggle, but you have to communicate with your managers, especially when it's on the job, and let them know, like, I don't understand. Like, can you explain it to me this way? Like, you have to know your learning style also. So if you aren't one of those learners that can read something and follow directions step by step, and you're more of a like hands-on or a visual learner, you have to explain it to them. Can you go through it and then, show me how you would approach this issue, and then maybe you'll grasp it more. So like, you have to just be transparent. Don't be shy. Don't be scared. I think they would understand more if you were honest with them than you not, sitting there and not being honest, and, they're wondering why you aren't turning in, your assignment or something like that. So just be transparent, and everyone's new at some point in time. So just remember that.
Do you have any recommendations or suggestions about knowing what your own learning style is? Because sometimes when I work with junior folks, and sometimes for me too, I'm not cognizant of what my own learning style is until I find that like I kind of bump up against something and I'm like, I don't get this. And I go, oh, maybe I don't learn well through videos, or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Are there ways that you can identify your own learning style well?
There are actually, there are a lot of like free learning style tests online. I'd say best way is to like Google learning style test. I actually did this for myself because I felt like I was not grasping any like documentation. I've learned that I'm a visual learner. And so like videos work great for me. Watching someone go through it themselves, it works great for me, but it probably wouldn't work for others. So like figuring out your learning style, especially during a job, or this is good for employers too, have your employees take learning style tests so you know how to approach that situation, and you know how to coach, and you know how to mentor them. So that's a great way something to implement.
That's cool. Rachel has a question in the chat. How do you make documentation a priority on diverse teams?
How do you make documentation diverse? You just have to, I don't know, you have to, You have to write for everyone. You have to write for everyone. You have to remember, like, this is times are changing, and you have to remember, like, as far as pronouns, you have to remember, like, I know me personally, a lot of documentation that like uses words like easy, simple, or things like that. It really bothers me, and also if it's a lot of jargon, words that use like guys, that like makes me feel a certain type of way, like as a woman. So you just have to remember those things, and just remember the times that we are in, and just make sure you have your team go over your documentation, and like be honest, you know, how does this make you feel? Like ask them questions, and like, so yeah.
Yeah, nice. Brittney, I have one more question for you to kind of wrap up, and it kind of relates to the end of your talk. I love how you concluded the talk. You said that this is important because it's about ensuring the future of tech. And it sounds like you're talking about the legacy of our industry. And I've never really heard anyone tie the importance of inclusion. I mean, I know it's important, but I've never heard anyone really tie the importance of inclusion to the legacy of our industry. So I'll ask you, maybe you could tell us, like, paint a couple of pictures for us. One is that, what do you think our industry would look like if we don't do inclusion well? Like over the next couple of years, what do you think will happen? And then maybe a better version is, what do you think it would look like if we did, if we started to do a better job at this as a whole? You know, what do you think, what kind of change and what kind of impact do you think that could have?
I feel like if we work harder to diversify tech, it would change a lot of people's narratives. I know for myself, I never in a million years would have imagined being in tech. And it actually changed a generational, curse for my family. But like, imagine what you can do if you take away the college, the traditional, you have to have a degree in order to be this. Imagine the doors that you will open for many families, or, you would change a lot of narratives. Imagine if you made tech more inclusive to women or to the LGBT community, differently abled. A lot of companies, they don't have their pipeline set up to work with people that are differently able. So like, I ask a lot of questions, especially when interviewing, how does this interview process work for someone with hearing disabilities? How does this work for people that are visually impaired? You have to, like, if you open those doors, you'll bring in a stronger pipeline of people that actually want to work, and for some people that come from different backgrounds, if you give them the opportunity to show that they can do it, I think providing someone that opportunity, they're grateful. Like, I know for me, myself, getting my first job in tech, I was so grateful, and it made me want to work harder. It made me want to prove myself. It made me want to, go be above and beyond, and like do a lot of things. So, it was, I think that changing that narrative and being more inclusive would really, really help.
That's so great. Brittney, thank you so much for sharing all of this. You tackled a really important topic that honestly we don't talk about enough. And so it's really great to hear you talk about it and give us some valuable tips and recommendations for how we can all do better at that. Thanks so much for that talk.
Thank you.